When people hear the word Crusades, they usually imagine faith, religious passion, knights marching beneath crosses, holy wars fought for God, honor, and salvation. But let me ask you, can belief, on its own, move armies across continents? Can belief feed tens of thousands of people for years? Can belief build ships, forge steel, pay soldiers, or keep horses alive on a march lasting months? No. Belief can inspire men to stand up. But money is what allows them to move. Behind every holy banner, there was a ledger. Behind every vow, a debt. Behind every crusade, an economy quietly taking shape. Welcome to Economic Story, where money, power, and history collide. And where nothing is ever quite as simple as it looks. In the year 1095, Europe was not a rich place. It was fragmented, violent, and economically inefficient. Power was decentralized. Kings ruled weakly. Nobles controlled land, but they lacked liquidity. There were no standing national armies. No centralized tax systems. No professional bureaucracies able to finance long-distance war. Wealth existed mostly as land, not cash. You could command peasants. You could extract food. But you could not easily mobilize money. And yet, within just a few years, tens of thousands would travel thousands of miles across hostile territory to fight in the eastern Mediterranean. They would need weapons, armor, horses, ships, food, and months, sometimes years, of logistical support. By any modern measure, this was a military project that should have been impossible. The call that set it all in motion came in November 1095, when Pope Urban II addressed the crowd at the Council of Clermont. His message was spiritual. Reclaim Jerusalem. Defend Christendom. Secure salvation. But beneath the theology was something else. A massive redirection of Europe's surplus violence outward, and, unintentionally at first, the birth of an entirely new financial ecosystem. Urban II wasn't selling a war to kings. He was selling legitimacy to individuals. The crowd at Clermont was filled with knights, land-holding warriors whose social identity revolved around violence, yet whose violence was more and more condemned by the Church. These were not monarchs with treasuries. They were second and third sons with no inheritance. Vassals bound by military obligation. Household soldiers whose livelihoods depended on fighting. For them, the crusade wasn't only a religious calling. It was a social test. To go was to prove honor, loyalty, and piety. To stay behind was to invite suspicion, moral stigma, even exclusion. Once prominent nobles took the cross, pressure cascaded downward. Participation became contagious. Faith held the door open. Honor culture drove people through it. And they never went alone. Crusading armies weren't professional forces. They were societies on the move. Knights brought retainers, servants, craftsmen, clergy, laborers, and dependents. Thousands of non-combatants whose presence turned expeditions into mass migrations. Europe didn't just export soldiers. It exported surplus violence, instability, and social tension outward, redirecting it all toward a distant frontier where salvation was the only promised return. The First Crusade, launched between 1096 and 1099, involved an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 people, including non-combatants. For individual knights, the cost of participation could equal several years of income. There were no state stipends. No war bonds. No treasury checks. Crusaders had to finance themselves. So they liquidated. Nobles sold land at steep discounts. They mortgaged estates to monasteries. They borrowed heavily from moneylenders. Some pledged future harvests. Others promised political favors. What mattered wasn't long-term solvency, but immediate liquidity. Salvation was time-sensitive. Debt could be dealt with later. This was the first quiet shift. War stopped being something you merely fought. It became something you financed. And once war becomes a financial operation, it starts attracting intermediaries. Italian merchant republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa noticed immediately. Crusaders didn't just need swords. They needed ships, transport, credit, supplies, ports, warehousing, insurance against loss. These cities weren't crusading out of piety alone. They were selling services to a continent desperate to move men and material eastward. By the early 12th century, crusading routes had become trade routes. Ports that serviced crusaders grew wealthy. Shipbuilders expanded. Contracts multiplied. What began as religious mobilization evolved into a logistics industry. And the church watched all of this carefully. The medieval church wasn't just a spiritual institution. It was a transnational organization operating across unstable kingdoms. It owned land. It ran courts. It educated elites. It recorded births and deaths. And crucially, it had moral authority no king could match. But it didn't have a standing tax system. It couldn't levy income taxes or issue debt in the modern sense. The Crusades changed that. To fund ongoing campaigns, the church authorized new forms of taxation. Clergy were taxed. Laity were taxed. In some cases, people could pay instead of fighting. Indulgences were offered in exchange for financial support. What began as emergency fundraising slowly hardened into recurring revenue. This is where belief became leverage. The longer the Crusades continued, the more permanent their financial structures became. Military orders like the Knights Templar, founded around 1119, emerged to protect pilgrims and fight in the Holy Land. But they quickly evolved into something else. They accepted deposits. They transferred funds across borders. They issued early letters of credit, allowing pilgrims to travel without carrying cash. By the 12th century, the Templars were running one of Europe's most sophisticated financial networks. Armored in steel but thinking like bankers. Then arrived the moment that tore away any illusion that faith was always the primary force. The Fourth Crusade was launched in 1202. Crusaders hired Venice to carry them east. The cost was staggering. When the Crusaders couldn't pay, Venice didn't cancel the mission. It redirected it. First against the Christian city of Zara. Then in 1204, to sack Constantinople itself, one of the world's richest Christian cities. For Byzantium, the outcome was catastrophic. For Venice, it was enormously profitable. Trade privileges. Territory. Wealth. Influence. The crusade hadn't failed. It had simply followed the money. By now, the pattern was clear. Belief mobilized the people. Finance decided the outcomes. Institutions learned to extract value from moral language. War became sustainable, not because it succeeded on the battlefield, but because it created economic activity. Europe didn't plan this shift. It learned by doing. And once the machinery was in place, merchants, financiers, taxes, military orders, it no longer relied only on spiritual zeal. The Crusades would, in time, lose their religious urgency. Jerusalem changed hands. Acre fell in 1291, ending the last major Crusader foothold. But the financial systems built to fuel holy war didn't vanish. They adapted. Because once a society learns to finance power, it seldom forgets. By the Crusade's 2nd century, the machinery around them mattered more than any battlefield result. What started as desperate faith hardened into a repeatable process. One that turned belief into money, and money into institutional power. And like any system that learns to extract value, it began shaping incentives that few participants fully grasped. The first clear winners were the intermediaries. Italian merchant republics didn't need crusades to succeed. They needed them to continue. As long as armies moved east, ships were necessary. Supplies were required. Credit had to flow. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa wove themselves so deeply into crusading logistics that war became a commercial dependency. The crusader fought for salvation. The merchant sailed for margin. This shifted who carried the risk. When crusades failed, losses weren't shared equally. Nobles came back ruined, if they came back at all. Peasants shouldered higher taxes. Local economies buckled under sudden liquidation. All the while, institutions collected fees no matter the outcome. Losses remained personal. Profits became institutional. This imbalance was accelerated by military orders. Across Europe, the Templars and Hospitallers amassed land. They accepted donations from crusaders in search of spiritual insurance. Operating across borders, they were exempt from many taxes and answered solely to the Pope. In effect, they transformed into medieval multinationals, extracting value from conflict while remaining insulated from its costs. The Church adapted with speed. What began as temporary crusading taxes became permanent. Indulgences expanded from rewarding participation to funding operations. Compliance was enforced by belief. Payment was ensured by guilt. With time, revenue mattered more than justification. Crusades were launched not just against infidels, but heretics, political rivals, even Christian cities. Once war turned financially viable, peace became the threat. And the losers, far more numerous, were also less visible. Peasants faced higher rents. Jewish communities were targeted as both lenders and scapegoats. Noble families collapsed beneath debt. Land steadily consolidated into institutional hands. The Crusades did more than drain Europe. They reorganized it. Capital concentrated. Power shifted away from warriors and toward financiers. The medieval economy didn't modernize by accident. It was forged under debt and disciplined by conflict. By the late 13th century, religious enthusiasm had faded. But the financial structures endured. They were repurposed. Taxation persisted. War finance evolved. Merchant republics pivoted toward empire. The lesson had been learned too well. And that lesson didn't remain in the Middle Ages. Modern conflicts are framed differently, yet the structure is familiar. Moral language mobilizes. Financial systems absorb risk upward. Costs flow downward. Contractors have replaced crusaders. Debt has replaced vows. The machinery survives, even when the mission fades. History doesn't repeat. But it trains. The Crusades taught Europe that belief can open wallets, that institutions profit from permanence, and that financialized violence becomes self-sustaining. That is the real danger. Not faith. Not ideology. But systems that require conflict to survive. Understanding this doesn't make you cynical. It makes you prepared. Because when money and power align behind moral certainty, the price is almost never paid by those making the decisions. If this story gave you a new way to see history, subscribe to Economic Story. History holds the answers. And here, we show you where to look.